Hey guys, this is chess coach Andrew Rankin with the UTOP Chess Institute. Today I wanted to introduce a game of mine that I played over the board in my most recent tournament, which was the Oregon Open 2022. I finished third place, which was really nice. And I'm going to feature one of my games, but most importantly, I want to introduce a key middle game plan in the exchange Queen's Gambit declined, and that's the minority attack. So the basic idea is we're going to use our pawn minority, which is two pawns, to attack our opponent's pawn majority. So first let's get to the position. So my opponent I played d4, I was white. My opponent played d5, I played c4, the Queen's Gambit, e6, and now I just decided to play the exchange variation. So pawn takes, knight c3, which puts pressure on the central pawn. He played bishop to e7. I put my bishop on f4. He put the knight on f6. Now I played queen c2. The computer doesn't like this, but I've seen grandmasters play this move, and the idea is to simply stop bishop from coming to f5. My opponent continues with pawn to c6. Now I play pawn to e3, and you notice we get the Carlsbad pawn structure where we traded the c pawn for the e pawn. My opponent's pawn structure is telling him that he should play on the king side for a king side attack using the bishops, the queen, and the dark square bishops to attack this way. And my pawn structure is pointing to the queen side, which says that I should play on the queen side with my bishops and with a minority attack. But that's exactly what we're going to talk about, so we'll get to that in a little bit. My opponent played bishop to e6, developing a piece. I played bishop to d3, now putting pressure on his h7 pawn. He played knight b to d7. I played knight g to e2. Now this is a little bit more flexible than the knight to f3. If I put the knight on f3, it means that I'm going to play rook b1, b4, b5, the minority attack. If the knight comes to e2, I can still play rook b1, b4, b5, but I can also play f3, e4, and break in the center. So my opponent drops the knight back to f8. Bit of a strange move, but he's rerouting his pieces over to the king side. I castled. He plays knight to g6, attacking my bishop. So I drop the bishop back to safety, and my opponent castles. And now it's time to talk about the minority attack. So the minority attack is simply rook to b1. Let's say our opponent plays some sort of waiting move like rook to e8. Then we play the move b4. If our opponent plays the move a6, we play a4. Then if the rook comes over here, we play a5. And this is your minority attack. So minority means we have two pawns and we're throwing our pawns at our opponent's three pawns. Normally, if your opponent has more pawns, it means that it's going to be really hard for you to attack with less pawns. But in this case, we get rid of our two pawns, and whatever is left on black's side is always going to be a weakness. For example, let's say that black takes, we take back, and then let's say he takes with this pawn. Now you see these pawns are all weak, and yes, we're gonna pick up the b5 pawn right away. Notice we should not play knight takes because the knight is pinned to our queen. But all of these pawns are now weak, and most likely we're gonna win two pawns after we win the b5 pawn, and white should go on to have an easy victory in this game. Notice if our opponent doesn't take the pawn, let's say for some reason our opponent decides to put the rook back on a8. Now we take, he takes, and this pawn is what we call backwards. It means that it has no pawns behind it that can defend it, and it really struggles to push forward. Notice if he pushes forward now, we can take it, and now this pawn is isolated and by itself and weak. And whenever you have a backwards pawn, the square in front of it is always weak. So we want to try and get a piece to c5. So we're going to play knight to a4 and then knight to c5. We're going to try and trade off some of black's pieces, and eventually we'll end up playing queen takes pawn. And if I'm trying to think if black does something else. Let's say he didn't play the move a6. Let's say he played the move rook to c8. Now, instead of bringing the a pawn, we simply push the b pawn if he takes. Again, we take, and we have these weak pawns. And if he doesn't take, let's say he plays a move like rook back to a8. We take, he takes, and once again, this is a backward pawn, and this is what we call an outpost square. So the square in front of it is an outpost, and we're going to drop a knight there. An outpost is simply a square that can never be attacked by our opponent's pawns. So since there is no d pawn, and there is no b pawn that can ever go to b6 or d6 to kick out a piece from c5, c5 is forever our outpost square, and we want to drop a knight into the outpost right away. So let's go back, however. So my opponent castled in the game, and in this game I decided to play rook f to b1. And my idea was that I wanted to play b4, b5, but after, for example, rook e8, b4, a6, a4, maybe bishop drops back here and we push here. And let's say he takes, I take, and now you see my rook is contesting the open file, and that was my idea. I simply wanted these rooks to be looking at each other and this rook to be looking at the b file. So that was my idea, was to contest the open a file, but what was very interesting here is after rook f to b1, my opponent played the move a5. And this is exactly what I was hoping for. So sometimes in chess, the threat is greater than the execution. Let me repeat that. The threat is greater than the execution. So the threat of playing b4, b5 to my opponent was greater than me actually playing it. In other words, I got my opponent to overreact with the move a5. And now, instead of playing a3, b4, which he's already preparing to stop, I'm simply going to attack the now weak dark squares that my opponent has created. So you notice all of these squares around his queenside are all dark squares, and they're all weak because he moved his only pawn on a dark square. So now all of these pawns are on light squares, which means all of the dark squares around his position is weak. And I hope that you remember there is one key dark square weakness that we always want to take advantage of in the Queen's Gambit, and that is the c5 square. So I want to get a knight to c5, so I play knight to a4. Now my opponent continues with rook to e8, a logical building move. He's trying to get his knight into e4 someday. I continue with knight to c5, and I think here black is already a little bit in trouble. If he's not careful, I might take the bishop, which would give me the bishop pair, which is always an advantage. And also the b7 pawn is loose. So I'm forking his two bishops. Sorry, I'm forking his bishop and the b7 pawn. And if he wants to take my knight, which he does, now he gives away his dark square bishop, which again, with his pawns all on light squares, he's going to end up with some really weak dark squares. So I was really happy to win the dark square bishop, which means now white has the bishop pair and black does not. So he continues with bishop to g4, which is actually the best move here. And his idea is he wants to trade off the knight and then sink his knight into e4, which forks my queen and bishop. And then he can win back my dark square bishop, and his dark squares are not so weak. So immediately I need to solve bishop takes, knight to e4, which forks my queen and my dark square bishop. So I need to solve this problem, and I decide to play queen to d6. And I want to trade queens because I notice that his position is very weak, and if I have the bishop pair, I can simply move my pieces around and around and around, and my bishops are so freely able to move that eventually I'll find weaknesses and capture a pawn or a piece and win the game. So he decides to trade queens, and now I'm really happy with my bishop. It controls all of these squares, which is just all over the board. Such a strong piece. He continues with bishop takes e2. I play bishop takes e2, and now he really needs to sink the knight into e4, but instead he gets a little greedy and he plays the move b5 first. And this allows us to play the same idea in the minority attack, only I didn't have to move my pawns, and I'm really happy when I don't have to move my pawns, because remember, every pawn move is a pawn weakness. So I immediately bring my rook to the half-open file and start to target this backward c-pawn. Remember, he can't move it forward because we control c5, and we want to put a piece on c5 because this is our square. This is a very important square that we fight for in the Queen's Gambit. So he brings the rook to c8, defending his pawn. Now I bring the rook up to c2, and I'm simply preparing to add more pressure to the pawn on c6. Now he brings his knight to e4, which attacks my bishop. I simply drop the bishop back to c5. If he plays knight takes, I'll gladly take with the rook, and then continue to apply pressure to the c6 pawn. He pushes his pawn to f5, and I play pawn to g3. Now the computer doesn't really like this move, but I thought it was very clever to play f5, f4, and try and get his knight active, and I didn't like the pawn coming to f4, so I played the move g3. But the computer, of course, is fearless and says I should continue with my plan and double up the rooks. Now he drops the knight back, which is really the losing move in the game. And the reason is because we take the knight, he takes with the rook, and now we double up. And he actually has no way to defend this pawn. You might be thinking, Andrew, he can simply play rook to f6, which defends the pawn twice. But if you look closer, you notice that these two rooks pin the pawn to the rook behind it. And we know that a pinned piece does not protect, which means I can play bishop takes b5. If he plays pawn takes bishop, then he loses the rook, and black is in really bad shape here. Black is in big trouble here. So that's why, instead of trying to defend his pawn, he simply pushed the pawn, saying you can have it, and we'll continue to play, and black is going to try and play with a pawn down. But instead of taking the c pawn, which I think I can take any time since it's pinned to the rook, I decided to play bishop takes b5. I want to win 2 pawns, not just 1. Now he pushes the pawn, saying, aha, you'll never win that pawn. But we know that this pawn is pinned, and what do we do to pinned pieces? Well, we put pressure on him. So we play pawn to b3. Again, he can't take, because rook takes rook, so he decides to push. And now who's defending this pawn? Well, it's the rook and the knight. I can't really get rid of the rook, but I can get rid of the knight. So I play bishop to e3. Now he plays rook to f6. We take the knight, and then we take the pawn. And now we're simply up 2 pawns. And once again, you see that black is left with only pawn weaknesses on the queen side. And these are something that we're going to easily target with rook c5, and then we take. So my opponent doubles up on the f-file and prepares to win my f2 pawn. Now I have a choice. I can bring the rook to c2, this rook to c2, or rook to f1. Which one do you think is best? So I really hope you brought the c1 rook up to c2. And this is the only good move here. And the reason is because I want this rook to be free to come out and attack. And I definitely don't want to bring my rook to c1 because then it can't move. It's stuck behind just a pawn and it can never move. And so there's no reason to bring your rook to f1. That's just makes your piece very sad. He's going to be crying in the corner if you put him on f1. Now my opponent plays the move pawn to h5. I decide to bring the rook up to fork or double attack the 2 pawns. He pushes the pawn to h4. And I bring my king to g2. And my idea is that if he pushes the pawn, maybe I'll take with the king. I do give up the f pawn, but then I'm going to win all of these pawns, and it should be a pretty easy win. So instead, my opponent brings his rook to f5, which laterally defends d5. But it doesn't defend a5, so we grab the pawn on a5. And now he pushes the pawn to g5, and it's a pretty easy win for white here. We push the pawn to g4. Notice his rook can't go to f4 attacking the pawn because the pawn guards that. So he gives this check. Now I really don't want to take the pawn and allow his rook to take on f2. So I drop back to g1. I really hope you didn't play the move king to g3 or even think about it, because then you get checkmated with rook f3. Game over. So we need to bring the king back to g1 here. Then he moves the rook because we were attacking it. And now our rook can pick up the pawn on d5. And he has no way to defend the g5 pawn. And soon we're going to come around and possibly win the h3 pawn or come over and win the e4 pawn. And these two pawns are just going to go by themselves. And so my opponent resigned here. So I hope you guys found that useful. The minority attack is a very strong weapon that you can play against your opponent in the Queen's Gambit Declined. Alright guys, I'll see you in class. Catch you later. Bye.